In 2017, the world of video games stood on a precipice, and while some people may have already seen the warning signs of the dark days to come, if we look back from our perspective today, we might say that it was actually the last gasp of light, and now we may be looking at the dawn of a new age, a new period where video games can be good again. And the point I'm referencing, because if you clicked on the title, this episode is about both the tragedy and the insurgency of Ghost Recon Wildlands and its sequel, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Reviewing video games really isn't the point of this channel, and if you've been listening for some time, you'll recognize that this is a bit of a departure from your regularly scheduled content, all jokes aside. But this one speaks not only to the heart of gun culture, but on how insurgency functions, which is where you get the title Ghost Recon Wildlands, Insurgency and Tragedy. See, on March 13th in 2017, Heather Alexandra publishes an article on the website Kotaku on Ghost Recon Wildlands, and she quotes it as such. Ghost Recon Wildlands seems innocuous at first glance. It is a passable open-world shooter where cooperative play leads to exciting gunfights and silly stunts. But Wildlands' core is far more insipid. It is propaganda. It is jingoism made playable, perpetuating the failed logic that all it takes to solve the world's problems, or the world's woes, is enough ammo. For some, her review, which doesn't get any better in tone and continues to attack the game not on its gameplay loop or as much, or not on its storytelling, but rather she attacks it on this layer of like propaganda and jingoism, which again is odd because for some this review actually sold the game, myself included. And at this time, we were starting to see a tide turn in 2017, where you would have these games journalists write articles about video games, criticizing them not on their capabilities, their qualities, but on not fitting the right story. And as a result, perhaps inverse or opposite of the author's intent, it would actually end up selling the game. See, the word jingoism comes up multiple times in her review, and for those of you who are listening, I think we need to take a moment to define it. A quick Google search and a quick encyclopedia search of jingoism gives you a definition similar to this: extreme patriotism, especially in the form of aggressive or warlike foreign policy. Which is a bit redundant because war is, by definition, a component of or a subsection of foreign policy. And so it would be, so jingoism in this case is aggressive war, the aggressive use of war as a foreign policy being motivated by extreme patriotism. And the story of Ghost Recon Wildlands does not take place in America. Rather, it allows the player to play. The player is an amalgamation of special operations sort of characteristics. They play a small team of 4, or the leader of a small team of 4, who is tasked by the CIA, let's call it, to take down a drug cartel, a fictional drug cartel, by the way, in a fictional representation of Bolivia. So if it's extreme patriotism to dismantle a fictional version of a human trafficking international drug cartel, well, then you can make that your own assessment. You can make your own assessment about that. And this phenomenon repeated itself where if the right journalist wrote poorly on a game, it would have the opposite effect. An example would be Far Cry 5, which is set in a fictional representation of Montana, where you, who beginning as a federal agent, take down a drug-infused doomsday cult full of caricatures of Americanism and sort of, religious iconography. It's a very Christian-ish coded sinner, 7 deadly sins doomsday cult that also turns out to be a drug cult as well. And so that game was attacked in the very same fashion as Wildlands, But it also produced the same effect of the game sold quite well and got a lot of attention. What am I trying to accomplish today with this episode? Beginning with what Wildlands delivered, we're going to cover both the player experience and its subtlety in storytelling to create both the fantasy of the game and the simulation of insurgency. I'm also going to present a defense of Wildlands, that the criticisms that are leveled against it were largely made by people who didn't get the joke. They didn't get what was being delivered. So instead of it being bad, they just didn't really get it. They didn't understand it. But then Wildlands was successful enough to create a sequel, and that sequel ended up being tragic. Immediately following Ghost Recon Wildlands, Ubisoft produces Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which was in its build up to its release, looked like it had all the hallmarks of being an excellent game. But when it was released, there was a rather tragic outcome, as it was not only not what was promised, but there's a whole bunch more involved. But I think we need to break down what that looks like. And that breakdown comes in the form of comparisons, which is the wordy way of saying we compare Wildlands to Breakpoint in narrative, interactions between characters, allies, enemies, and gameplay. So 5 categories: narrative, interactions, allies, enemies, gameplay. Finally, if Ubisoft and the publisher of Breakpoint took many strides to try to save the game, but the question is, was that sinking ship fixable to begin with, and is it worth playing in 2025? And finally, as the rumors of the newest Ghost Recon are starting to emerge, I want to talk about some things that we want to see and things that we don't want to see, because this is all built within a framework of video games and culture and what they do and what they ought not do. Now, this episode is couched within the context of gun culture, and this episode of the Redacted Culturecast is sponsored by none other than Obsidian Arms. And one of the features, one of the things that made Ghost Recon, both Wildlands and to a lesser extent Breakpoint, enjoyable to the audience is that you could customize your equipment. Now, if you want to replicate that capability in your life, if you want to add self-sufficiency by having the right tools for the right job, I would recommend going down to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com, using the code below for 10% off your order, and go and pick up, again, my suggestion, one of their punch-in toolkits specifically built around the AR-15. Not only do they come with a lifetime warranty, if you damage one, they will replace it, but also they are of a quality that I have been admiring for about a year now. Whether I'm building a new piece of equipment or I'm doing maintenance, I am very thankful to have the right tool, the right job, so I'm not constantly losing springs, which if you've ever built anything in the AR variety, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But they do quite a bit more, including OEM manufacturing for those who have ideas that they want to bring to market. So if you want to support the show, or if you are interested in these products, go down to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. And again, don't forget to use the code below for 10% off your order. Let's begin with what Ghost Recon Wildlands is, or was, or what it meant at the time. From a short description of the game itself is sort of an insurgency / guerrilla war simulator, where the fantasy of the game is that you, the player, can take down a fictional drug cartel set in a fictional Bolivia, complete with landmarks and natural environments like the Bolivian salt flats or the Road of Death. And you do this by sort of doing the special operations thing. And like I said earlier in the intro, it really kind of combines multiple jobs within that world into one. For example, not only are you collecting intelligence and analyzing it, but you're also selecting your targets, taking down strongholds, doing night raids, ambushes, and eliminating high-value targets. The gameplay somewhat resembles that of Grand Theft Auto. It's a third-person played game, but instead of a hooker-banging, cop-killing criminal, you play as an amalgamation of special operations into what would look like a unit more elusive than Delta Force. In some of the subtext that you can find in the games, the characters are sort of graduating from Delta Force into this secret ghost unit. It's a thin veil for real-world organizations. But that's what the game is set in. And so what players could do is that they could begin the game by creating something like themselves. I've even gone to the extent of trying to set up a kit and equipment like what I saw in the game. For example, I could play a character that not only did I get to customize to look like myself, but it included gear that I had used and a mix of real world things, albeit with sometimes that uncanny valley connection, but most of it was quite grounded. Unsurprisingly, I've spent most of the game using equipment, using weapons that I own myself, using optics that I own myself. And I've got, for example, my character is typically using a Mark 18 and an SR25. And he's usually got some sort of cry pants on and a flannel or a button-down top, something like that, maybe a combat top, and a cry jumpable plate carrier or a JPC. And so the player gets to start with a self-insert of creating themselves as the special operator. And then they get to drive boats and planes and helicopters, again, all modeled after real-world vehicles, even with their logos changed. And they get to use these vehicles and these weapons and these tools, night vision, thermals, and drones, which we'll get to later, to infiltrate their objective, whether through like a halo, high altitude, low opening, like a parachuting or skydiving infiltration, or they can do like an over the beach. They can take a boat there. They can use other methods, oftentimes attributed to special operations, like low visibility with civilian type vehicles, or even like tank-like things. So they have all this. They have this kind of sandbox that they get to play in. But there's another layer to it too, because incorporating the fantasy of the special operations world, they get to kind of work with a partner force. See, there's a rebel group within Bolivia that's trying to fight back against the cartel. In this fictional world, this fictional Bolivia has been taken over by the cartel, creating it as a narco state. And there are people who don't want that to be the case. So now you're already hinting at regime change. And if you work with your partner force, if you do these small little kind of side missions to expand their capabilities, you can then call for fires. They'll mortar a location that you call out. They'll scout out an area for you. They'll distract opponents. They can support you in a gunfight, or they can deliver vehicles. So there's again, this idea of like investment in the world that's starting to build. The core gameplay loop is built around gathering intelligence on high-value targets, the bouchons. I think that's the pronunciation. I should know by now. But each region has sort of a warlord or a leader involved with that area. And so when you enter into a region, you begin by collecting intelligence on them, and that might be what are their habits, what are the things they do, what's their pattern of life, what are they known for, or how you might effectively strike at them. As you gather intelligence, you're going to do a series of missions that might include sabotage or kill capture of a lieutenant, or tracking somebody, following them. And you have all these different types of missions, maybe an ambush here, a raid there, surveillance here, that eventually culminate in you taking down that high value target, whether in a kill or a capture situation. Sometimes they turn themselves in. And that's the core gameplay loop. You go into an area, you reconnoiter the area, you conduct reconnaissance in a very video game fashion, you identify key intelligence about your target, and then you might find equipment, a new weapon, a new scope, and then you strike out against the target. The player strikes the target. But then, mind you, this game came out in 2017, and another key gameplay feature, one that was front and center to its release, was that your character has a drone with them. You can kind of launch this little drone and use it for reconnaissance. And we're seeing now with the war in Ukraine, again, 7 years later, we're 8 years after this game was released, but within 5 years of the game's release, we got to see the same TTPs that you use in the game replicated in Ukraine. I'm not saying that Ghost Recon Wildlands inspired Ukraine. I'm thinking it was a little bit more prophetic. So then the players could also tailor their loadout to their objectives, but most importantly, and I think one of the things that made it go so well, at least for myself, is that I could play with my friends. I could gather 3 of my buddies and we could all go do a night raid together against a cartel. The fiction was thick, but it was still grounded in reality. What the game didn't deliver in overt gameplay, it delivered in subtlety. See, weapons, optics, clothing, accessories were mostly grounded in real-world equivalents. There were some differences, some changed names, but most things were true to form. You could use a JPC by Cry. You could wear Cry pants. You could use a T1 micro red dot on your rifle. And the setting of the game attempted to do what Ubisoft had done with another one of its titles, namely Assassin's Creed. Instead of placing the game, though, in history, Wildlands was a modern historical fiction, and the player does what they do in many Ubisoft games, is they conduct an insurgency. They build up a revolutionary force against an overarching bad guy. Careful, that can come across as pretty Marxist really quickly. But the story is told through briefings, and although these briefings bear a hint of the Hollywood, they reference emerging factors like social media, they reference intelligence agencies, terrorist recruitment, and competing narratives. So what I think is going on is, and what I think happens specifically with the review that Heather Alexander published in Kotaku, is that she's kind of butthurt about her ideology being susceptible to terrorist recruitment. But that's a low blow. Let's look at addressing some of the criticisms that she makes and responding to them. So, once again, the Ghost Recon Wildlands review by Heather Alexandra, published in Kotaku, she writes, "They churn out banter that moves from unbearably dull to patently offensive, tossing out the kind of pithy one-liner that only teenagers would find cool before sitting down to make a homophobic joke. Wildlands wants them to feel alluring, but they mostly just feel like assholes." And this is where I think Heather doesn't know what's going on. I know that can be sort of a low blow again, but it turns out that the banter between characters in the game is heavily steeped in like the inside jokes of the military. References to cocaine for the altitude, or SEALs not quite as quiet professionals kind of litter the banter between the main characters. And what I think is happening is that these jokes went way over Heather's head. There are times where like your character will say something that like would be sort of depicted as machoism, but it's tongue in cheek. It's humor. The character is making fun of the like, hell yeah, brother, till Valhalla, brother kind of mentality. It's really told in subtlety, and and it's told in subtlety referencing a community that Heather is not part of. Returning to the topic of jingoism, Heather writes, Wildlands also thrives on jingoism. It wants to talk about narco-states, but can only muster the brutish El Sueño as the villain while depicting a caricature of Bolivia. So what is it? What is the criticism? Is Bolivia not accurate enough? Or is it the fact that it's set in Bolivia that is your problem? See, the game has you allied with a freedom fighter who, spoiler alert, sort of turns on you in the late stages of the game. And in the end, it doesn't go well for him. This could very easily be understood as a critique or a challenge to how regime change is rarely clean, or in the case here, it points to sort of the Che Guevara Castro events of regime change that end up going much worse than what was intended. One of the challenges is that the cartel itself does not have complicated motives. They're not really a philosophically developed enemy by any sense of the means. Rather, their motivations are pretty straightforward: power, wealth, women, money, whatever, right? But the way that they achieve that power is a little bit more complicated. The way that they've organized it does speak to like emerging technology, again, the use of social media and popularity. And what I think is perhaps a criticism in reverse is that the very same things that the game lists that make this cartel popular and effective, or at least supposing their existence, is also reflected in certain subcultures of the United States, particularly ones that are prone to rioting. So maybe a subtle element of Heather found this insulting and decided to turn it on the game. That might be going a little too far, though. But let's now, one of the criticisms that she makes has to do with the banter, and I think what it identifies is that the game was not made for her. Well, then who was the game made for? If you're watching on YouTube, you're seeing that I'm wearing a multicam arid top. I'm wearing like a Cry Combat top right now. It felt appropriate. Don't get at me for it. But the game Ghost Recon Wildlands was made for casual gamers who are interested in military simulation games. They're the players who are not really interested in getting in depth as, say, Escape from Tarkov, which I know came later, or like the Arma series, which it can be extremely granular. Rather, in contrast to another Ubisoft title, which is Rainbow Six Siege, it's not trying to hyper focus on a single aspect of, say, combat and special operations, but rather kind of do everything at a casually enjoyable level. It really does hat tip not only towards the gun culture, but also towards military veterans or military in general. There are uniforms or uniforms that you can equip on your character. One in particular, which is the only place I've seen represented in video games or film where a very specific radio is on the chest of the player. And I think it's on like the Mali LBE. And the only other place I've ever seen that radio used ever, anywhere in the world, is Ranger Battalion. And so, again, I think the game is sort of directed at people who know a thing or two about cultures adjacent to the gun culture, the milsim culture, the airsofting community, the veterans, and so on and so forth, right? It's kind of gamers who want a casual yet entertaining fantasy of special operations fighting against a cartel. And this isn't the only form of media that has done it. There are movies like Sicario and Triple Frontier. There's books about it. In fact, it's a common joke amongst young men in the military to kind of joke about using their skills against a drug cartel. So it's not really directed at the game's journalist, which again is reflected, and that continues to be the case. And the game is also a fantasy. There's a certain level of realism that's suspended. For example, your character can carry hundreds and hundreds of pounds of equipment, explosives, grenades, ammunition alone. I wanted to do the scaling on it, but I'm pretty sure at some point in time, like a normally equipped character in the game is carrying like 600 pounds. You're not sprinting up a mountain carrying 600 pounds. Another fantasy of the game is that your one team kind of does it all. They do everything from collection to execution, all of it really unsupported. There's not an intel analyst giving them material. They have to do all the work themselves. With all this together, Ghost Recon Wildlands holds a special place in many gamers' hearts, like in myself included. It calls back to a time where I got to go do fun things with my friends. I got to fly drones and do night vision and like kind of play the night raid thing with friends, oftentimes keeping us together despite living apart. And so it's not really a surprise then that with the success of Wildlands, the publisher, Ubisoft, worked hard to produce a sequel. And in retrospect, it's a rather short amount of time, but Wildlands was released in 2017, and in 2019, Ubisoft announced and released its sequel, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. And Breakpoint was completely staged for success. It identified many of the things that players enjoyed about Wildlands, which was a deviation from what Ghost Recon had been in the past. It identified what a lot of the players had enjoyed, and it added new features. You could even engage in greater customization. It advertised that you could now choose what kind of knife you used in like a close quarters combat, a melee combat capacity. There was a wider array of real world kit, or at least there was supposed to be. And it introduced an entire new stealth as well as survival system where you had to hide from drones, or you could use the natural environment to better camouflage yourself, as well as had to concern yourself with water and food and bandages to better address the enemies that you are going to be facing. Right off the rip, the game offered something new. It also, like from its release, players could now kind of tailor how they played the game. instead of just turning the difficulty up to harder, they could tweak certain elements of it. For example, one of them that I think was, even in retrospect, stuck so well, was actually delivered excellently, is you could either choose to be led from objective to objective by a very clearly marked waypoint in your compass, in your map, or whatever, or you could choose a little bit more of a difficult approach where you would be given land navigation hints, like, say, this region, this feature, this direction, but it wouldn't tell you exactly where to go. So you had to actually use the map and learn how to read it in order to find your objectives. And although it was a coincidence, Breakpoint was released just before COVID. And if we remember what 2020 and 2021 did for the video game world, is it was a huge boon to them as people were more or less stuck inside or told to be so. This, again, would have suggested that Breakpoint was going to be a massive release, or it was going to be a massive success, especially as its prequel, or the one that came before it, its predecessor, did such a good job at having people play together. But unfortunately, and I don't know whether it was expected or unexpected is the point, but Breakpoint had a failed launch. It was an unsuccessful launch by far. Many people who loved Wildlands jumped into Breakpoint, were immediately turned off by it, and most likely never returned. Some of the reasons why it had a difficult launch were typical to Ubisoft, the company that made it, which is it was buggy, it was full of errors, it was kind of slow moving and a very unpolished product. It also had an element of being the canary in the coal mine. See, Ubisoft over time would appear to develop this strategy where they would put an excess amount of bloat and RPG mechanics into a game, RPG role-playing game mechanics, like having your gear's effectiveness was determined by its score or its points, and the points that it would receive would be sort of randomly generated by a computer. So these RPG mechanics would not only suck the player out of the game, but it would turn it into a bit of a grind. And the player, instead of going from fun experience to fun experience to fun experience, would have like a key storyline beat, and then they'd have to kind of slog and trudge through all this stuff, relying on the role-playing game mechanics of the random number generators to give them the right gear that has the right numbers and the right scores before they could proceed onto the next level or the next part. It wasn't really an experience based. It wasn't based on the skill level of the player. It was almost entirely dependent on whatever this amount of time spent collecting widgets, which is where it got rather devious, because this is the first time that I witnessed Ubisoft offering an opportunity for players who had already bought the game to pay more money to speed up the drudgery of it. Very strange. So instead of going from fun experience to fun experience, key core element of the game and core experience of the game, you'd have a key element filled with, and then after that, it'd be filled with a bunch of bloat that no one really enjoyed as much, except for a very small handful of people. And then before you could get to the next one, you'd have to kind of traverse all this slog, unless you wanted to pay Ubisoft more money. Then you could speed that up. And this would be replicated later in the later games, games that came after it, namely the Assassin's Creed titles, until it got so bad that they finally decided to change course. Maybe we'll see if that sticks. But so there is a certain level of criticism leveled at Ghost Recon Breakpoint for how it failed. That might be corporate greed, or that just the structure of the game didn't deliver, or it was delivered poorly. They should have kept it in development for another 6 months to a year to really polish it off. But as I mentioned in the intro, there are 5 different things that I wanted to compare: narrative, interactions, antagonists, allies, and then finally the gameplay. Because I do believe that these 5 elements had more of an impact on the success or lack thereof of the game than really the sort of this generic idea of corporate greed. So let's look, and the intent of these comparisons between how Wildlands delivers on it and how Breakpoint delivers on it, the reason why I would bring these up is hopefully, I doubt it, whether or not it happens is not up to me at this point in time entirely, but it would be a hope that this information gets out into the world and somebody at a video game studio or somebody who's interested in video game development considers these things so that they don't create the same errors, or potentially with the rumor of a new Ghost Recon title on the horizon, that the developers might hear what we have to say and make those corrections. So let's start with the narrative. In the narrative of Ghost Recon Wildlands, the character, the player, is sort of a self-insert who's tasked with dismantling a cartel. They're tasked with dismantling a drug cartel. And it's set, even though it's set in a fictional version of Bolivia, the player is on a mission. That mission is rather straightforward, which allows them to explore different ways of solving the problems. As we were talking about earlier with what the players get to do in the game, whether it's skydive into objective or take a sniper shot at 100 yards or 1,000 yards or whatever, or find a certain SMG, or be able to explore the environment, travel in mountains, race on the Bolivian salt flats. The game, the narrative of the game, albeit simple, is delivered in the bad guys that you go after. So much of the story is delivered through conversations, like as you progress on dismantling the cartel, whether it's their security apparatus, their distribution apparatus, their production apparatus, or their influence campaigns. You're dealing with different aspects of a large organization, which adds some variety to how the story unveils. You kind of get to choose how you proceed through it, and there's a light guiding in difficulty levels of certain regions, but overall, it's not so much a storyline that has this convenient plot, but it's more like you're trying to defeat you're set with a rather straightforward objective. You got to defeat a drug cartel. And this is in contrast to Breakpoint. Instead of being set in a fictional world grounded in reality, the entirety of Breakpoint takes place on a fictional island that is some sort of amalgamation of tech, like Silicon Valley, tech genius Elon Musk, that kind of arena. You're dealing with drones now, and the storyline is a bit disjunctive. In the beginning, you're basically sold something like a revenge fantasy. You arrive on the island, there's it's a catastrophic landing, your entire team is killed or separated, and now you need to try to escape the island, and in doing so, you need to take revenge on the person who betrayed you. So Wildlands is a special operations versus a drug cartel. Breakpoint is this sort of split between surviving a technologically superior force, a revenge fantasy, and some awkward, ham-fisted philosophical conversation coming from me that might mean something about technology. Again, it's set this fictional Silicon Valley tech island paradise. Does deliver some pretty cool environments, but it doesn't do it well. It doesn't. Some of them are memorable, and perhaps the environments are one of the better parts of the game, but the story kind of has you going from like a data farm to whatever, like a data farm to like a mountain resort or a chalet or like a secret underground bunker of some sorts, and the story isn't really that relatable is the problem that makes it very difficult, because the antagonists, which we'll get to later, drive a lot of the story from a distance, and there really isn't like a cathartic development going on. It's just, well, who betrayed you? Why? Where did this happen? You're supposed to kind of explore it, but you're also told what it is. And it can basically be broken down to, you arrive at an island because of you, the character, the player, arrive at the island because of a distress signal are immediately destroyed by, or down, your helicopter is downed and your team is killed by drones and super secretive super soldier bad guys that they're not even super soldiers, but the wolves, who turn out to be ex-special operations dudes who are dissatisfied with the current whatever. And then you're trying to escape, and then you're trying to get revenge, and the player character are almost immediately the bystander in somebody else's debate about ethics and new technology, and you're in between, you're performing the same raids for narratively insignificant reasons. And this goes to the interactions. In Wildlands, the majority of the interactions come from character banter, which happen as you're doing things in the game, short cutscenes, radio traffic, maybe an interrogation here, maybe a capture there, maybe a briefing by your handler, so to speak, in the game. So the majority of the interactions come in these sort of environmentally appropriate ways. Again, you get a briefing, it comes in the form of, you got to watch like a 1-minute video or something like that. And the character interactions themselves pair this sort of Hollywoodism. You know, there's a little bit of like again, I think I said it earlier, a humoristic kind of over-the-top Hollywoodism. Think of like the first Predator movie, I ain't got time to bleed. Like, no one says that, but it sounds funny, right? At the same time, there's a lot of these sort of if you know hints buried in the context. Most notably, you know, one character makes a joke. He's like, "Oh no, we're quite professionals. What do you think I am, a SEAL?" And it's funny because of just like when the game was released. The machoism of the NPCs and the player characters are contained, at least in a hint of subtlety, pairing tongue-in-cheek with interrogation drama. This is contrasted by Breakpoint, where the player is presented or portrayed as a hammer looking for nails in a house made of glass. The entire story is funneled through conversations where you're the third wheel, as two other players or two other characters, non-playable characters, are having some sort of conversation about what's going on. And they're, again, this kind of Silicon Valley tech amalgamation, and the game arriving or delivering a lot of its story in conversations leaves the player character as something that spoke, and acted in conversations in the way a games journalist imagines a game culture or a gun culture gamer would imagine a special operator to act. It's a simulacrum of a simulacrum, a copy of a copy, a caricature of a caricature, where the player character, this special operations guy who just survived some sort of horrible event, has no tact. He's always smashing and stammering his way through intellectual topics while getting tutted, lectured to, or corrected by, the smarter techie people. Yet, and that again leads to how the game plays. You go have an awkward conversation with a techie dork, then you go raid a building, then you go back and talk to the techie dork who lectures you about AI, then you go raid another building, and then you come back, and this loop is get lectured, go attack something, get lectured, go attack something, or listen to somebody, two other characters talk about, some sort of minute ethical dilemma. And the interactions are just terrible. They're just terrible because the player is no longer really a player. They're just, in almost a very eerie way, now being lectured to by the NPCs about something that is germane to the game, but they're no longer a participant. So in Wildlands, the player plays an active role. In Breakpoint, the player plays a passive role, despite, being led from scene to scene to go do the bidding of the techie NPCs. Now let's flip this over and look at the antagonists. The bad guys in Wildlands, even those who are caricature-like, they had character. They had some sort of gravitas. You would have, sometimes they're comical, like one is a radio host, and one is a beauty queen, and one is a lover boy, and one is a musician, and one is a charismatic pastor of sorts. So, the characters were memorable, sometimes for malicious, devious ways. They're creepy or terrible, the terrible acts that they do, sometimes for other reasons. And while they're not really characters that have depth, you're not exploring the human condition in their soul, the player doesn't start the game trying to do that. The player wasn't really trying to figure out the nuances of their motives. Rather, they're trying to collect intel on them on how to take them down. In contrast, the antagonists in Breakpoint were, well, equally as shallow, but they are kind of present this illusion of complexity without offering the player any meaningful interaction. The bad guys were cool on paper. They were a rogue set of special operations mercenaries who decided that the powers that be were utilizing it wrong. They weren't doing the thing. There is a frustration of this, a very real frustration of this that happens within the military, where it seems like there's a disconnection between the people who make the decisions and the people who do the work. This isn't a new idea, but the problem that you get here is that the bad guys then, instead of having any, like, they're advertised as having some sort of foresight or some sort of moral dilemma with the way that their military is being managed, then just kind of turn into generic drone NPCs that don't do anything. They just take over the island, and now they're just like, I'm bad. That's it. Like, okay, that's a weird motivation. You're like, oh, the origin of your organization is dissatisfaction with the way the military is being run, particularly in the operations level. So your result is to become a generic bad guy. Don't get it. But there's also another layer of shallowness to it. And I'll use the example of the character referred to as the Flycatcher. If you read all the subtext, you'll find that he's supposed to be some sort of boy genius that's great with using drones. And he just wants to be liked. He just wants to be loved in some sense. And the fact that he is identified by the antagonist characters as somebody of value is all it takes for him to join the team, which unfortunately is not too dissimilar from reality, where terrorist recruitment cells will find people dissatisfied or hungry for starving, let's say, for acceptance, and offer them an opportunity to belong. But this is only delivered in like reading through the subtext, and ultimately the entire interaction that you have with Flycatcher is you walk into his room, crouch behind a desk, and shoot him. And if you hit him in the face, he's down, and it's over. Unless you're using the bullet sponge mode, which is miserable. Now, considering that, so your interactions with the antagonists are mostly non-existent, maybe told with especially the main antagonists, they're told in sort of cutscenes or flashbacks, but there's just not a lot of grounding that keep the player involved. Opposite to the enemies, you have the allies that you work with beside the game, and the allies, in the sense of Wildlands, are a Bolivian local freedom fighter insurgency. You are an American special operations guy engaging in unconventional warfare. It is literally an unconventional warfare simulator, and you are working by, with, and through the Bolivian freedom fighters while doing your own things, your own raids, to engage with a cartel. They will work at your bidding. You get to advise and assist them. And throughout the story, tensions arise between the player character and the partner force, the Bolivian freedom fighters, over, say, objectives and methods, pointing to moral challenges of regime change, or even issues of like idealism, where you have this like communist approach. At some point in time, the freedom fighters have a very like communist coded language, and there's a bit of a challenge there. You as the player have to kind of wrestle with that, even though it resolves throughout the story of the game. In Breakpoint, however, instead of allying with something kind of grounded in reality, you end up allying with or teaming up with, which is we'll get to in a minute, these sort of generic Star Wars rebel type NPCs. They even match the aesthetic. Take the kind of, how do you put it? They're vaguely nomadic, culturally ambiguous with their aesthetic, They're guided by some sort of tech Gnosticism or a mystical approach to technology, and their moral ethic is conveniently opposed to a generically evil, tyrannical force of militaristic paramilitary super soldiers. We'll get to that in a second. Immediately after the introduction, the player is forced to accept these NPCs to have the right intentions, such as liberty and freedom and inclusivity. And so immediately off the rip, the character is just introduced to Erewhon, which is your like safe haven, and all of the characters fit. You could literally rip them right out of this game and put them in a Star Wars movie, and they would not be out of place at all with the Rebel Alliance. The story asserts these island locals as freedom fighters against an empire sort of their own creation. Again, these are like the tech people who went to the island paradise, and then the island paradise turned against them. They're kind of tech hippie rebels who eke of and maybe come right up to the edge of saying true communism has never been tried. But the problem is that like they don't really tell you they don't really do much except for tell you what to do, where to go, and how to help them write songs for the revolution. Again, you as the player are sort of led from objective to objective by the so-called allies, the locals of the rebel locals of this island, but they don't really even support you. They don't provide call for fires. They don't support you with mortars. They don't support you with scouting. They don't support you with literally anything, at least in the base game. So you're already losing something from the first one. Not only do you not have a party anymore, which they had to fix, they had to patch that in, they had to add NPCs to be on your team, but your allies, your supposed allies, don't do anything but lecture you and tell you where to go. I still have to double down on this issue. The player is a puppet of somebody else's rebellion. Instead of playing an agent in the world, you play as a pawn. And you play as a pawn for the, as I said earlier, vaguely nomadic, culturally ambiguous, aesthetic guided by a tech Gnostic mysticism, with a driven moral ethic conveniently opposed to a generically tyrannical force of militaristic, paramilitary super soldiers. I know that's a handful to get through, but it's like we've seen this sort of character archetype is not even the correct use of the word archetype appear before. The movie Creator was a very excellent looking game that began with a good question, but unfortunately it's basically a Star Wars game or movie without the title. And that generic Star Wars rebel type, like freedom fighter, is unfortunately worn out. I don't need another Han Solo lookalike to, not be entertained by. But that leads to the last point of comparison, which is the gameplay. The core gameplay loop of Wildlands survived its course. It would add new features over time. Eventually, they would involve something like a tier 1 mode, which would expand what you could do in the game. They would also add a way to play it where you'd have what's called permadeath in video games, where if you die in the game, it's over. You have to start all over again, which is a nice challenge. It adds a sense of tension to and so a higher level of risk to the game. You'd hate to get all the way to the end and then die. But then it also, the core gameplay loop included new acquisitions having meaningful impact in the character's gameplay. A new rifle, a new skill node, a new magazine, a new scope, a new way to use the drone, a new piece of equipment, whether it's frag grenades, you start with frags, but like different types of mines. Each one of them added to the game. But Wildlands also had parts where the game just kind of felt clunky. The controls weren't always smooth, but this ended up being kind of part of the game. Most of it felt rather polished at release, with a couple of corrections to be made over time, but overall, from the beginning, it functioned quite well. Players of Breakpoint, however, had the opposite experience. Breakpoint not only struggled at launch with its pseudo role-playing game mechanics, it had to try to repair them over time, offering players a way to play Breakpoint just like they played Wildlands. They could go back to a familiar model that was more functional, or players could even sort of customize their environment, which I think was sold as a solution, but I will argue that I don't think it delivered as well as they wanted it to. Breakpoint leveraged the idea of the super special operations soldier put in a distressing situation without resources, and it did this with its stealth system, which within a couple of hours of the game felt more like a chore, having to cover yourself in mud again to hide from another drone flying overhead, lest you'd have to get into a long, drawn-out gunfight with sort of bullet spongy enemies. The RPG elements were just not well received. Instead of having the fun and the excitement of getting a new piece of gear that you did, or even hunting down and finding it in Wildlands, now every time you picked up, say, a new weapon or a new piece of armor or a new piece of gear, whether or not you enjoyed it was determined by what random number appeared on the screen. The RPG elements alone, the sort of statistics-based gameplay, not only did they come across as a bit of a cash grab in the early days of the game, but they removed any satisfaction from getting a new piece of gear. Did you finally find that sniper rifle that you wondered or you wanted to get in the game? Too bad its stats are too low. You might as well break it down and get rid of it, or go to the store and buy a better version of it with American money or with your own money. And that pushed the player away from the game. Not only were you pulled out of the immersion of the experience because nothing mattered but the numbers on the equipment, but you were always dealt a dirty hand, knowing that if you didn't like it or you didn't want to go grind and try to find another version of the rifle that you wanted, maybe albeit this time with better stats, you could just go buy it from the store. And this just sort of felt meaningless. New gear didn't matter because you'd be replacing it within a couple of hours or maybe a couple of days, depending on what equipment it was. And it only had any sort of impact on the player if it was suddenly like a massive leap in capability, which would only really result in that bullet sponge enemy that you'd have to dump 5 magazines into eliminate them would maybe take 4 now. And Ubisoft has another title that already features this problem, and that's The Division. And so, while originally The Division and Wildlands were 2 completely distinct games, what Ghost Recon Breakpoint did is it kind of it brought in elements of The Division and it mashed it into the world and the gameplay style of Breakpoint, which didn't deliver. And again, this is those RPG elements where equipment has statistics instead of set values. Whether or not it was effective is determined by whether the number is randomly rolled high enough, and that would determine whether or not you would dump 5 mags or 4 mags into an enemy just to eliminate them, or how long you would have to sit there hiding behind cover, popping up, taking some shots, and moving on. So the core gameplay loop from Wildlands was gather intel, explore, eliminate, exploit. The core gameplay loop of Breakpoint was go grind until the number's high enough, and then you can move to the next station unless you want to pay the company to move past that. From launch, the enemies in Ghost Recon Breakpoint felt like a chore. Whether it was drones or bosses or heavily armored guards, this bullet sponge problem really only implicated power upgrades like getting more equipment, and it removed any satisfaction from defeating them. There was no skill really involved. It was just time spent grinding to get the gear to then not have to be in such a chore to defeat the guy. An opposite version of how this works would be games like Legend of Zelda or Darksiders, which kind of have this rock, paper, scissors approach to making enemies not only more difficult, but to encourage player progression. Maybe you need to find a grappling hook in order to defeat this guy, or you need to find a certain arrow or shield or piece of equipment in order to progress and defeat a certain enemy. Instead, the role-playing game approach that Breakpoint presented is just get more numbers more bigger. Ouch. The gameplay itself, outside of just the role-playing aspect of it, also had marked steps backwards. For example, in both games, in both Wildlands and in Breakpoint, you can equip night vision and go do things at night. However, and in Wildlands, it functions perfectly. You can have a lot of fun. I played more than half of the game at night or in night vision because it was a callback to a previous job I had. It gives you an advantage. Only you can see your lasers. You can engage your targets. It makes it easier, not easier, but it's just kind of, it's part of the fun of the game. The problem is that night vision mode in the sequel, in Breakpoint, is barely playable. And when I'm saying night vision mode, it's like you take the character and you equip night vision. The night vision functions in the first game. It doesn't really function in the second game, even though they kind of do the same thing, which is weird because you'd think it would get better, not worse, or at least have some sort of storyline element that drove that difference. Also, they're both using green FOSS. White FOSS was a thing in 2019, so kind of catch up with the times, guys. Also, both of them had issues with things that kind of broke the realism, especially for those who know. For example, the use of lasers. But another final example on one of the issues, the setbacks that Breakpoint suffered that was done correctly in Wildlands was you couldn't even get the controller to work properly. If you're someone who grew up long enough ago, or you use an inverted Y stick movement, this is all going to be a very specific conversation, but I'll make it more explanatory in the end. You could invert your controls on a controller, all except for one. You couldn't invert the controls on the drone. So you would play the entire game like you normally would, except for the drone, which you use at least once every 5 minutes. Now you would have to go back to standard and then go back to inverted. And it was just this completely buggy mess, which is a surprise because it's like what that means is that the developers overlooked a core element of the game, its function, which is a huge disappointment. So Wildlands, while is an older game, is a better polished, better functioning game than Breakpoint, which is sad. In Wildlands, you could create yourself. Most of the equipment, most of the gear that you could have, you could equip the shirts, the hoodies, the plate carriers, the pants, the boots. Most of that was available right off the bat, and all the most common popular stuff like Cry Pants, where you could just, if you couldn't find them or achieve them in the game, they were already available from the beginning. Later on, they would release cosmetic packs, but those didn't, if I recall correctly, that wasn't at the initial part. That kind of came later. But from the release of Breakpoint, they took what was arguably the most popular leg clothing, which doesn't really have any statistical value in the game, except for because of the way that it works in Breakpoint. They put that behind a paywall. Cry Pants are ubiquitous. They're in all these video games. Not saying everybody has them, but you couldn't wear Cry Combat Pants without buying it, which is kind of like saying, oh, what is the most common item that players are going to use for cosmetics? Just put that behind a paywall, knowing that they'll probably pay the $4 to wear the pants because they want to play it through the game. And do that at the beginning. It felt like predatory microtransactions in the game. But now what would happen over time? We're ending on the comparison of gameplay. In release in 2019, I'll make the assessment that Breakpoint was unplayable. It was just unenjoyable as a game. The RPG mechanics made it unenjoyable. The characters made it unendurable. The world building was uninteresting at all. It was just immediately a dismal experience. No element of it was fun. No element of it was productive. Over time, they would release update after update, allowing you to remove the RPG mechanics if you wanted to, allowing you to just focus on the story, allowing you to skip a lot of that, or even just kind of enjoy the game as something as like a modified or improved version, a next version of Wildlands, which would be fun, right? Mostly, yes. The burning question at the core is the game playable in 2025? After all the improvements, all the corrections, all the changes, is it worth buying in 2025? Well, half that answer is probably, because you'll probably be able to find it for like $5 somewhere. I think that's what I paid for it on the PlayStation Store. I spent $5. I got a couple of good hours, maybe 10 good hours, maybe 15. Actually, I think right now I'm at 25 hours or whatever. But over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years, I think I picked it up. Yeah. I've probably put 20 hours in it, 25 hours, and I've enjoyed it enough to kind of get the highlights that I wanted, but ultimately it just doesn't have the grasp, the desire to finish like something that Wildlands provided. So if you're playing as a casual, you can tailor the game to the way that you want to play. Mind you, some of the core release elements will be sort of harder to do. For example, they have this kind of raid concept. Raid as in you go with 6 other players or 5 other players and you do a complicated thing on another island. I don't think you can really do that now because I don't think there's enough players on the game to do it anyway. And that's going to prevent you from progressing certain elements of the game. Not really the storyline, but like developing some of the subclasses. The strong point of it in 2025 is that you can choose the way that you want to play the game, whether you want to have to do the land navigation yourself, or if you want to be led waypoint by waypoint, you can take out the RPG mechanics or you can keep those in. You can tailor the amount of drones that you have to hide from. You can really kind of build it in your own world, giving it more of that mill simulation experience. And I bring this all together, and this is where we're going to depart from the comparisons between the two and let the past go and look at the future. Right now, the rumors are starting to spread of a new Ghost Recon game on the horizon. And there's a couple of things, even though this message itself, even though this episode may not reach the decision makers over at Ubisoft, I want to, at least as what I would imagine is your identified customer, tell you what we want to see in this game, or at least something that I would want to see in the future of the Ghost Recon franchise. Whether or not we want to bury the hatchet is one thing or another, but I can tell you what gamers want to see and probably what they don't. And I'm going to point to other success stories and show where this has been done successfully. First of all, remember that the player is supposed to insert themselves into the character, not you, the developer, not the games journalist, not the politician or the chronically online. The thing that made Ghost Recon Wildlands so much fun is that from the beginning, the player got to insert themselves into the game. That is what a role-playing game where you create your character is supposed to be. Where Breakpoint failed at this is that you didn't get although you got to design the aesthetics of the character, they were completely unrecognizable, brutish, boring, and ultimately completely thrown to the wayside by the way that the narrative was delivered. So remember, create ways for the player to insert themselves. When it comes to gear, focus more on real world gear. We want to see a Cry plate carrier, a Pharaoh Concepts plate carrier. We want to see people, Team Pharaoh versus Team Spiritus, represented in the video game world. There are other examples of how this is done very well in video games, like Escape from Tarkov or Ready or Not. Although the game Ready or Not doesn't have an expansive level of character customization, all of the options either directly reference real world equipment, or they're a very clear hat tip to it. I have a Pharaoh Concepts FCPC5 in the real world, and my character in Ready or Not has the same plate carrier, albeit with a slight different setup. But allow players to do that. Maybe you can expand the customization with weapons, referencing or referring to real world equipment, both in cosmetic, maybe in gameplay affecting, maybe their gear, they get to choose where their pouches go, or they can choose different setups, different ways that it looks, have those expand. Make sure that you're not putting key items, popular common items behind a paywall. If you're going to put items behind a paywall, I'm sorry, I can't advise you on that because it's at best cringy. It's at best cringy. At worst, it's predatory. But Ubisoft has already failed that dramatically with games like the Assassin's Creed series. But I digress. So focus on real world or real world representing equipment. It's already been done. You can do it again. You can do it better this time. Focus on weapons customization, whether it's cosmetic or gameplay affecting. Make sure that the optics are correlating to reality. Make sure that I can put my T1 micro on my Mark 18, or I can put my proof research barrel in my AR-15, or I can build the game out to do what it is. One of the things that sold Ghost Recon Wildlands for me was that I could switch my weapon from fully automatic to semi-automatic, and I played the entire game with my M4, my Mark 18, and semi-automatic, because that's how people who use those weapons in a deployed status do. That's how the operators use them. They're not running around with their M4 on fully automatic. They're running around with it on semi-automatic. Well, it's unsafe, but you know what I mean? They use it in semi-automatic, and that was like, they get it. When I could load myself into Wildlands, when I could build a version of myself in Wildlands, take a piece of equipment that I'd used professionally, equip it in a very similar fashion, albeit your laser application's a little weird, and I could put that in the game, and then I could turn my weapon onto semi-automatic and go perform a night raid in a very similar fashion to what I had done in the military. That's what sold the game to so many players. This hat tip realism can be expanded on. For example, one of the issues that Ghost Recon continuously does wrong is how lasers are used. For information, in case you don't know, in case you haven't decided to hire somebody who knows a thing or two about how this equipment is used, when you are using night vision in conjunction with an IR laser, how it works is I aim my rifle. When I aim my rifle at something, I turn my laser on. After I finish my engagement, I turn my laser off, and then I keep it off until I'd need to do that again. So in other words, when I equip a laser on my rifle, it's not on all the time. I turn it, when I aim, I turn it on. When I stop aiming, I turn it off. This has been done in video games already. In 2010, the video game Medal of Honor incorporated this into their game, where when you were using a laser on your rifle, it worked the way that people who use lasers in gunfights use them. By making sure IR lasers work properly in a game with a flood, where they turn on when you're aiming down sights and they turn off when you stop aiming down sights, this is, I think they did it that way in some versions of Call of Duty. I'm not sure, but this is an opportunity to incorporate real world elements with near peer threats. For example, perhaps in the beginning of the game, intel suggests that the enemies do not have any night vision capability, which gives you free reign to use the laser with no discipline up to your heart's content. But later in the game, you will encounter enemies who intelligence suggests that they have night vision capabilities, which means if you turn on your laser, you're going to give away your location, forcing the player to find different solutions to more complicated problems. You've already included the jamming of equipment and drones. You've already included scouts and drones as a scouting asset. Now include different types of drones, not in the weird behemoth way that you've done in Breakpoint, but in the way that they're being used in Ukraine. You've got scouting drones and suicide drones. But the main thing is that you want to have hat tips towards realism and chase after what might be near future without just going straight into like generic sci-fi slop. Instead, do not chase the Fortnite algorithm. If you're going to experience with the fictional, at least have it grounded in reality. If you're going to have different characters that have their aesthetic and their equipment represent their person, their persona, their whatever they are. If you're going to have characters that their depiction of their gear is part of their identity, what we don't want to see is the sleek gamer girl, hacker, hero shooter, sex appeal, yoga pants wearing, but plot twist, she's a lesbian approach to character design. We don't need more characters like Ella from Rainbow Six Siege. We don't need more characters like Tracer from Overwatch or the new game Delta Force. Like all the female characters in that game are all the same thing. They're all sex appeal, yoga pants. I mean, like if I see yoga pants in the game, it's going to be an issue is the long and short answer, because that's not what people would wear in the environment that Ghost Recon is supposed to be set in. So instead of ham-fisting fake sex appeal characters into your game and then trying to hide it behind a veil of, I don't know, being transgender or a lesbian, like no one cares. Keep that out. Recent games have identified that a pattern starting to take place. As I mentioned at the beginning, instead of 2017 being the precipice of video games, I think it was the setting sun on a season where we are going to have to endure the darkness of the night, and we might be looking at the dawn of a new season of games built for people who want to play games. We might see a renaissance of sorts, a renaissance to the video game world, especially from Western production or Western producers who have, for the last, I don't know, say 10 years, at least since 2017, have been chasing the games journalist as their audience and the boardroom as their bottom dollar, and they're being influenced by the DEI money and the woke stuff and all the other kind of politics that you want to get involved, and they've completely been pulled away from creating something that not only functioned well but entertained its audience and did what it was supposed to do. Destiny is a perfect example of this, because while people have been debating about the games as a service model being successful or not, Destiny is arguably one of the more surviving, one of the better versions of that. You could go back as far as like World of Warcraft, but let's stick with games as a service here in Destiny. From its launch in 2013, Destiny promised a 10-year experience, which to us was a massive, awesome idea. We were going to be able to enjoy the ever-expanding exploration of the solar system after a dark age with our friends while gathering new equipment, building our legend, as the title said. And we were excited about the prospect of 10 years of periodic story development. What we were delivered, however, is not only some issues with, say, how the story was delivered. I think the beginning, although was missing some parts, was actually pretty good, where the players got to be rewarded by discovering new material about it, and that Destiny did something very well, where an element that they would like a hint that they would drop in year 3 would deliver in year 6. There was this long form approach to it. They would set up a reveal years before it became relevant, investing the player in the story. But by year 8, you couldn't go a play session without gender politics getting awkwardly shoehorned in. You, the player, would get back from some raid of a special, you had to acquire a MacGuffin to move the story forward, and you would go do a highly challenging, adventuresome activity. And when you get back, instead of having the storyline developed, you get told that, oh, surprise, the new main character is also gay. And I'm not making a joke about this. It's not that this has to be about gender politics. It's that, like, why that's not even a storyline beat. It's just, why am I getting pulled out of the game to be told that the robot is gay? I don't care. I'm interested in saving the solar system, not about the sexual preferences of the characters that I'm surrounded by. And there are examples of games in recent past who have all done very well in kind of games of the year arenas that have hearkened to this element. Expedition 33 brings back classic RPG elements. It's a world. The world is the gameplay is turn-based. You have a turn-based RPG elements with characters who are interesting, witty, and they're developed, and you see their expressions and you try to understand who they are. And so, like, Expedition 33 does this great. It goes back to an old model, the overworld, the exploration. Not everything is delivered in exposition, and you have an excellent example of a game that respects the player and it delivers an excellent product, even though it's using a system that has been since considered defunct. Turns out it's not. Another example, Baldur's Gate or Divinity 2. Baldur's Gate has gay characters in it, but you're not lectured about their homosexuality at every moment of the game. You're still one of the lead characters of the game. In both Divinity and Baldur's Gate, you play as the character who has agency in the game. In Breakpoint, you play as the pawn who gets dragged through all of the events. You don't need RPG elements in every game, but if you put them in, they shouldn't be poor imitations of other products. Let Borderlands be Borderlands. Let Divinity be Divinity. So what have we accomplished here? I know this is a long conversation compared to many of the other episodes that I've released in the past. Let's go back to where we started. Ghost Recon Wildlands was kind of the last bastion after a period of darkness. And it delivered something, a fantasy and a guerrilla warfare simulator. And I'll double down on that one. If you're interested if you're trying to figure out what insurgency and guerrilla warfare is, it's Ghost Recon Wildlands. Insurgency is the part where you're building the rebellion. Guerrilla warfare is the unconventional form of engaging with the enemy. You're not an army versus an army. It's not maneuver. But it was largely successful on subtlety and storytelling and player experience. It had a realm of like, if you know, you know, which is why I believe a number of games journalists wrote really poorly about it, because they weren't the target audience and they might have found an offense in that. The whole jingoism thing doesn't matter. It's not a successfully delivering criticism. The machoism is tongue in cheek for people who know. For people who don't understand, they probably took something that was supposed to be a joke real as serious, and as a result, I don't think their opinion really lands. Don't worry about Kotaku's opinions about things. They don't seem to be doing so hot anyway. But then the Success of Wildlands produced the sequel, Breakpoint, which, although poised for success, although had a hat tip towards all the things that made Wildlands successful, turned out to be a disastrous release for multiple reasons. And while many other people will focus on, say, the business model or the predatory microtransactions or the RPG mechanics alone, I think that it really comes down to the narrative was poorly delivered. It was disjunctive and unconvincing to the players. The interactions between the player character and NPCs basically made the player the third wheel in every conversation. Allies were that generic Star Wars Rebels types that could be replaced with half of anything else, unmemorable, and worse, kind of annoying. They lectured the player on some sort of ethics issue and then sent him out, making the player not an agent but a pawn. The enemies were even more forgettable than what came before them. And finally, the gameplay difference between Wildlands and Breakpoint is that Wildlands delivered, Breakpoint did not. Breakpoint in some cases was a setback, and the new features were not only poorly accepted, but in many cases outright rejected, suggesting that the original model could have been improved on. There are some things that you could take from Breakpoint that would be added to something like Wildlands and make it better, but overall, there needs to be some wisdom in what to add and what not to add, what to take from Breakpoint and see what parts to abandon wholeheartedly. And I think I've covered those. Get rid of the RPG elements, focus on references to reality, make sure the player gets to insert themselves, tell the story through the player, not through cutscenes where you're the third party. And then, I asked the question if Breakpoint is playable in 2025. I think it is, but know what you're getting into. And finally, as we're looking at the next Ghost Recon possibly coming out, I wanted to make sure we included some suggestions. Video games in our culture video games within culture do something that other things can't. Video games tell stories and allow people to be a part of that story. So build the hero's journey into your next game instead of dragging them through as a passive player. Have the player be active in the story, not a passive participant waiting for the cutscene to end so you can get to the next thing that you're not interested in seeing. Video games do what other media cannot, so do that well. You don't need RPG elements in every game. Let Borderlands be Borderlands. And ultimately, we play video games because we enjoy the storyline. There might be issues of escapism. There might be issues of, say, becoming delusional, thinking that video games are close to reality. We don't need it to be a perfect realism, but we want to be able to at least enjoy it. So, if this comparison between Breakpoint and Wildlands, if you've gotten this far to the end, thank you for listening to something that has been, I'd say, near and dear to my heart for a while, but also something that I enjoy, and I don't want to see it taken away. I don't want to see that this kind of thing that, I use video games to stay connected with friends who live across the country. I don't want to live in a world, not live in a world. This topic is a little bit near and dear to myself because I use video games to stay connected with people who live far away from me. And I don't want to see this thing that we share, that we get to spend time together with, turning into something that we don't want to have anything to do with. And there are examples of predatory behavior or malicious behavior, but ultimately this is a good faith argument for trying to describe what Wildlands did and what Breakpoint didn't do. So if you're still here, you're still listening, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening in. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. If you want to support us, you can head over to redactedllc.com. You can leave a comment below on other games that you think did well, or where you think games like this should go, or what you would like to see in the new Ghost Recon game, and maybe we can have some discourse on that. Maybe if this gets enough views, maybe it will find itself in the halls of Ubisoft as they're developing the next game. Maybe we can actually work together to make these things better instead of constantly being at each other's throats. I don't know. It's not really in the cards for human nature, but let's give it our best shot. With that being the case, if you also want to support the show, don't forget to head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. With that, we'll talk to you later. Now go forth and conquer.